I forgot how to work this thing. Okay. Now, so during this time, last week we talked about, how God went from Abraham to Isaac to Jacob, and then he went into captivity. And then after they came out of captivity, they had Moses, and Joshua was the one that took them into the promised land. Once they're in the promised land, well, then they broke it up into different tribes, and one tribe had a position up here, another one here, another here, and broke down the boundaries. And that went on from David it went Saul, David, and Solomon. And when Solomon died, because he had built that kingdom up tremendously, and he had 700 concubines. He had thousands of chariots. He had hundreds of wives. And God said, you're not supposed to multiply horses. You're not supposed to multiply chariots. You're not to multiply wives. But he did all of that. And he taxed the people. You figure it took him 7 years to build a temple. And David had all the materials already lined up. But it took him 13 years to build his house. And so Solomon was a good person, but he used the people and he taxed them to death. And so when the kingdom split, Rehoboam was Solomon's son. Jeroboam was someone else. He had fled as a political prisoner down to Egypt, so Solomon wouldn't kill him. So God told him, come on back, I'm going to give you 10 of those tribes, and it's going to be the northern kingdom. So Jeroboam went to Rehoboam, said, give us a tax break here. And Rehoboam said, forget it. He says, you thought my father was tough, I'm going to be tougher. And so Rehoboam, was going to overtax him. Jeroboam says, look, what do we have anything to do with Judah? So the northern kingdom became known as Israel and the southern kingdom as Judah. And also because Ephraim was the biggest tribe, many times in the book here, we see that God refers to Ephraim, then he'll return to Israel, then Ephraim again, and Judah. And the whole story here is God is using Hosea and his family as an object lesson, like a show and tell, but just drag it out over 70 years. And if you can imagine 70 years trying to preach a message, and the people are saying, well, you hush with that story. Will you get out of here? Nothing's going to happen. And so this is what he says here. And I'm going to go through and I'm going to tell you the meaning of these names as we go. Okay, the word of the Lord that came unto Hosea. Now, Hosea means salvation. That's from the same root word as Yeshua, Jesus, as well as Joshua. So that means salvation. And the other names like Joshua and Jesus are variations, like Jehovah is salvation or God is salvation. So Hosea means salvation. He was the son of Beeri. Beeri means the man of the well, or it's my well. So it's kind of saying that he was one that was going to be giving the fresh water. He is going to be giving out the word through his son to bring the nation back. And then he says, in the days of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, of kings of Judah. Now, he said he reigned during the time of these 4 kings that were down in Judah, but here he is up in the north, okay? And he just names one king. He said, in the days of Jeroboam, the son of Joash, king of Israel. Now, Joash was the king of Israel, the northern, and all these others were down in the south. Now, there were 2 Jeroboams. Jeroboam the first was the one that was arguing with Rehoboam about, the land and the taxes and things like that. Now, he's already off the scene, and there's been about 6 or 7 other kings after him. But Hosea doesn't mention any of those kings, but there's another Jeroboam that is Jeroboam the second. Okay? And he's during this reign that he's talking. So he doesn't mention these other kings because every one of the kings of the northern kingdom were wicked. They were all bad. And I gave you a breakdown probably about a year ago, of all of the different kings that were good kings and the bad kings. Well, here, that all the kings of the northern were wicked. But the thing is, they were very, very prosperous. And who was it? Charles Dickens, who wrote The Tale of Two Cities. I don't know. I've never read it. But he made a comment. It is the best of days and the worst of days. Okay, and that's what you could say here with Hosea, because it was the worst of days, because they had just conquered many of the cities around. The northern kingdom did. Many of the cities all around them. And they were very prosperous, And when they were prosperous, they forgot God. And they went to worshiping idols. Now, it was the best of days because the military strong and the economy was great. It was the worst of times because they were morally corrupt. And they departed from the Lord God. And they went, worst of all, to idols. And now, here we'll go on through, and it says, the beginning of the word of the Lord by Hosea. And the Lord said unto Hosea, go take a wife of whoredoms and children of whoredoms, for the land hath committed great whoredom, departing from the Lord. Because the northern kingdom, when Jeroboam the first separated from the south, he instituted calf worship. Remember, that was the thing that when they came out of Egypt and Moses went up on a mountain, and when he came down, they had built a golden cow down there to worship. And so they still had that in the back of their mind after hundreds of years. So when they separated, Jeroboam said, look, he said, that's too far for you. Like Dan is 100 miles up here in the north. It's too far for you to go down and make your sacrifices. So he set up in Bethel, which was one of the places that says Bethel is the house of God. And so he set up a calf there, Bethel. That's where Jacob was for a while. That's where he met God. And then he set one up in Samaria. And then he set another one up in Dan. Now, that's why when the people, we haven't gotten to captivity yet, when they went into captivity with Babylon and came back, the people of Samaria wanted help. And they said, ain't no way, you're a bunch of half-breeds. We don't want you working with us. And so, because they couldn't prove their genealogy of where they were from. So there was always this friction. And that's why Jesus said, I must needs go through Samaria, because he's got sheep up there too. But anyway, he's going down through here. And he says, I want you, there's a book that's called the Jerusalem Bible. And he says the things in plain language. He said, Hosea, I want you to go marry a whore. And I want you to have children with that whore. Because the children of Israel have committed whoredom because they left me. And then over in one of the other chapters we'll get to next week, it says that my people are destroyed. Let me see, I might even have it here. Let me see if I can find it. Because they have, here it is. Verse 6 of chapter 4. My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge, because they have rejected knowledge. I will reject thee, that thou shalt be no priest unto me, seeing you have forgotten the law of thy God. I will also forget your children. So, back earlier when they came out of Egypt, God said, that you are a chosen nation, you are a royal priesthood. And so he said he was going to give them up. And that's why in the New Testament, they say that we are a chosen people. We are now the royal priesthood. But we didn't replace Israel. We'll see this in a minute. And then in verse 3, so he went and took Gomer. Now, Gomer means complete, finished, complete. Okay, and then the daughter of Diblaim, which conceived and bare a son. Now, Diblaim, it's a funny name. It just means two cakes. Two cakes. Now, the people here would understand this. Is
Cakes.
two cakes. Cakes. Two cakes.
Okay.
See, it's because during the feast for Israel, see, they were up here now and they were rejecting God, but when they had the cow, they had to have things that they could remember, So remember, they had the wave offering at the harvest time. They had the wheat and they would wave the wheat up, and then they would have loaves of bread in the temple, okay, without leaven. Well, here, his name means two cakes, and you'll get the picture a little bit later on. It says, and the Lord said unto him, he had a son, call his name Jezreel. Now, Jezreel is the name of a city, and it's also a name of a valley, but it's also the name of this child. And she conceived again. Oh, wait, I didn't finish that part. The Lord said unto him, call his name Jezreel, for yet a little while, and I will avenge the blood of Jezreel upon the house of Jehu. Now, after Jeroboam II, there was a king in northern Israel, because they were all wicked, that God used him to overthrow Ahab. Remember Ahab and Jezebel, the wicked king? Well, he overthrew them, and then Jehu, and this is back in the Chronicles, and if you want to look it up, I can find the verses for you. He said, okay, I want you, the people here, if you want to follow me, follow me. If you want to follow Ahab's sons, follow Ahab's sons. And so, no, they didn't want, So he said, okay, if you're going to follow me, I want you to bring all of Ahab's sons. And he had 70 plus sons. And he brought them up to this valley of Jezreel, and he cut off their heads and killed them all. And that's the thing, is it was a wicked king. And that's what he says here, and I will avenge the blood of Jezreel, upon the house of Jehu, and will cause to cease the kingdom of the house of Israel. He said, look, these kings are all wicked. I'm going to take them away. They're not going to have a king anymore, and everybody's going into captivity. And see, this is the promise that he's making here through Hosea. And then he says, and it shall come to pass at that day that I will break the bow of Israel in the valley of Jezreel. It means that he's going to break the bow. He's going to take away their power. And the thing is, he's trying to tell them, Assyria is going to come down, and then he's going to take you captive. But he says, and so his wife, she conceived again and bare a daughter, and God said unto him, call her name Lo Ruhamah, for I will no more have mercy upon the house of Israel, but I will utterly take them away. See, he's saying now the whole house of Israel, he said, but your daughter is going to be the demonstration for these people to see. And Lo Ruhamah means not having any mercy. And here it's another fact is that she did not know who her father was, because she was a result of Gomer going out practicing whoredom. Then he says here, but I will have mercy upon the house of Judah. Now see, this is strange. He says that I'm going to take the northern kingdom away because they were all worshiping the calves, the Baal. But the southern kingdom had good kings down there, and Hezekiah was a pretty good king. He took away all the idol worships and stuff. So he said, but I will have mercy on the house of Judah. And he said, I will save them by the Lord their God, and will not save them by bow, nor by sword, nor by battle, by horses, nor horsemen. Now, Sennacherib from the Assyrian army came down in 722 BC and took the northern kingdom captive. I mean, they were wicked. They slaughtered everybody. You know, the ladies that were pregnant and couldn't walk too far, they just cut them up. And so they took them away. But where he says, I will spare Judah, the southern kingdom, this same group, and we talked about this sometime earlier, that Sennacherib came down and encamped around Jerusalem and Judah down south. And they could take some of the smaller cities, but they couldn't conquer Jerusalem. And Isaiah was prophesying down there, and he went into King Hezekiah and said, look, he says, don't you worry about Sennacherib. He says, God is going to handle it. And he said, just wait. And that's where he says, the angel of the Lord went around and killed 185,000. 185,000 of those soldiers. And then Sennacherib went back. He said, don't you think we've given up? But Sennacherib went back to Assyria defeated, and his own sons went into the temple where he was worshiping his idols and killed him. I mean, it was wicked during that time. But, you know, when we read that, can you imagine 185,000 people laying around your compound? You know, it takes a long time to bury or get rid of that amount of people. But anyway, we must move on. But the Lord said, I am going to take care of that. Okay, then he says, and when she had weaned Lo-Ruhamah, she conceived and bare a son. Then said God, call his name Lo-Ami. You are not my people, and I will not be your God. Now, that's got to be hard for Hosea, you know, to hold a little baby in his arms and say, hey, he ain't mine, you know, and I ain't going to take care of him. That's hard. But can you imagine if he went out and the kids were outside playing and he would say, Lo-Ruhamah, it's time to eat. Lo-Ami, it's time to eat. It says, I'm not having mercy on you. You're not my kids. That's what he'd be hollering out there all the time to call the kids in. And Jezreel, it's time to eat means I'm going to scatter you. But the word Jezreel means to scatter, or it means to gather. Now, the word Jezreel here is also another name for Armageddon. That the battle of Armageddon is going to be fought in this very place. And then he says here, he says, yet, and this is interesting. Here he says, yet the number of the children of Israel shall be as the sand of the sea, which cannot be measured nor numbered. And it shall come to pass that in the place where it was said unto them, you are not my people, there it will be said of them, you are the sons of the living God. And you know, this is in the book of Romans. It says, and you are called the children of the living God. And now that's Romans, I think it's Romans 9 and chapter 20, Romans chapter 9 and verse 25 and 26. Then he says down here in 11, then shall the children of Judah and the children of Israel be gathered together and appoint themselves one head. Now here, he's looking way ahead in the future. He said because he knows the northern kingdom is going to be captured by Assyria. And you know, they always say, well, there's 10 lost tribes of Israel. They're really not lost because when Jeremiah, the first Jeremiah, set up those calves, the worship, you know, the priests are saying, we're out of a job. We worship Israel's God, you know. So the priest went down south to Judah. And some of the people who were tired of all those bloody sacrifices, they went up north, you know. So the tribes really, and people up north who wanted to worship Yahweh, they went south. And that's in the book of Chronicles, how they just changed places. They went down there to worship and stayed there. So he says, people are going to think the 10 tribes are gone forever, but they're not. And he says, then shall the children of Judah and the children of Israel be gathered together, means he's going to take them from all over the world, and appoint themselves one head, and they shall come up out of the land, for great shall be the day of Jezreel. Okay? Now, let me see, there were five prophecies I wanted to let you see, and okay, it's the next chapter. Now we're getting over to chapter 2. Now he says, remember, this took place over years and years. Then he says in chapter 2, verse 1, say ye unto your brethren, now he's dropped the low. You see, he's dropped the low. He says, say to your brethren, Ami. Ami means my children. The low meant no. No, you're not my child. But now he says, say to your brethren, Ami, and to your sisters, Ruhama, says, plead with your mother. So he's saying to them, your mother's a prostitute and she's hanging down there in the brothels. Go tell her to come back. You know, and he says, for she is not my wife, neither am I her husband. Let her therefore put away her whoredoms out of her sight, and her adultery from between her breasts, lest I strip her naked and set her in the day as she was born, and make her as a wilderness, and set her like a dry land, and slay her with thirst. Now, you have to picture this, that here, Gomer has already gone back into adultery, and she's probably living now in a brothel. And here is Hosea. He's dying of a broken heart because she's had these kids that aren't his, and he's taking care of them, and she's down there. You know, and so he's saying to the kids, go plead with your mother. I've done almost everything I could. And God is saying that to Israel. He said, look, he says, I am the one who gave you the wine. I am the one who gave you the corn. I am the one who gave you the sunshine. I'm the one who gave you the rain in these days. I am the one that brought you up out of Egypt. And he said, you are worshiping these gods, a calf, you know, an animal. And then he says in verse 5, and in verse 4 he says, and I will have mercy upon her children, and they be the children of whoredoms. For their mother hath played the harlot, and she conceived them, hath done shamefully. For she said, I will go after my lovers that gave me bread, and my water, and my wool, and my flax, mine oil, and my drink. Behold, I will hedge up the way with her. Now, here, God is telling Hosea, go get her. And he's saying, now I have put a hedge around her that she's going to be looking for these things and not be able to find them. She's going to look for her lovers, these false gods, and nobody's going to want her because she's nothing but a prostitute now, and she's degraded herself in such a way. And so she was sort of trash, some would say. Then he says, and she followed after her lovers. Oh, I missed that part. It says, put a way of thorns around her. In the book of Job, God said to Satan, have you considered my man Job? And he said, yeah. He said, but you've got a hedge around him that nobody can do anything to him. No wonder he serves you. And so God said he put a hedge of thorns around Job, that Job couldn't overstep his boundaries, and Satan couldn't overstep his boundaries to do anything to him other than what God said. So God is saying here, I'm putting a hedge of thorns around Israel. They're going to look to these gods whenever the rain stops and the fruit dries up on the vine. They're going to look for these gods, but they're not going to find them. Just like Gomer is looking for the people that she had all these relationships with, and they don't want her. Then he says here, therefore I will hedge up the way with thorns and make a wall that she will not find her paths, and she shall follow after her lovers, but she shall not overtake them, and she shall seek them, but shall not find them. Then shall she say, I will go back and return to my first husband, for then was it better with me than now. See, he's going back and forth from what Israel, and then from what Hosea, then his family, and then. So then they go, for she did not know, talking about Israel, she did not know that I gave her corn and wine and oil, and multiplied her silver and gold, which they prepared for Baal. We're in Hosea, the book of Hosea. And it's in chapter 2, and I'm reading verse 9 now. And then in verse 9 he says, therefore will I return, and I will take away my corn in the time thereof, and my wine in the season thereof, and will recover my wool and my flax given to cover her nakedness. And now will I discover her lewdness in the sight of her lovers, and none shall deliver her out of my hand. And I will cause all her mirth to cease from her feast days, her new moons, and her Sabbaths, and all her solemn feasts. And I will destroy her vines and her trees, whereof she hath said, these are my rewards that my lovers have given me, and I will make them a forest, and the beasts of the field shall eat them. And I will visit upon her the days of Baalim, wherein she burned incense to them, and she decked herself with her earrings and her jewels, and she went after her lovers and forgot me, saith the Lord. He said, I'm not going to give her rain. I'm going to let the figs dry up. I'm going to let the olives fall off the trees. I'm going to do all of these things. So he's taken away all of the provision he gave to Israel, and he says, and they're going to go into captivity. And we're going to see in other chapters, he's going to say, how can I give you up, O Israel? How can I let you do this to yourself? It's because he says that if I withdraw my mercy, I know your hard-hearted stubbornness is going to get you in worse trouble. And he says in some of the prophets, he says, I have no pleasure in the death of the wicked. He says, but how precious in the sight of the Lord are his saints. So the people who really worship God in truth, that's precious when one of them dies. We suffer because we lose a loved one, but heaven rejoices because there's a new name written in glory. Then he said, therefore will I allure her and bring her into the wilderness and speak comfortably unto her. And I will give her her vineyards from thence, and a valley of Achor for a hope. And she will sing there as in the days of her youth, and as in the day when she came up out of the land of Egypt. Now, here, you have to know a lot about the Bible in order. He said, because I will give her her vineyards from thence, and the valley of Achor for a door of hope. Now, the valley of Achor goes all the way back when they came out of Egypt, and Joshua and his troops went over. Remember, God said the battle is mine, and they had to walk around Jericho, and the walls fell down. Everybody's happy. And then later on, they were going to go to this little tiny town of a couple of thousand called Ai, and that's where Achan saw. They were defeated at Ai, and they couldn't believe it. And Joshua says, "Oh Lord, where are you?" And the Lord says, "Get off your face." He says, "There's sin in the camp." And God hates sin. He just gave him a victory, but he said, "Everything you take from these places are mine." Then when they get to the other places, he can say, "You can have that." But Achan, he said there was this Babylonian garment and a piece of gold and everything, and he went and hid it under his tent. And so Joshua had to call all the people of the nation there, and it fell upon Achan that he had stolen something, and they took all of his family, all of his children, all of his relatives out into the valley of Achor, and they stoned them all to death, and then the earth swallowed them up. And God would say, that was a valley of trouble. But he says here, Israel has sinned greatly because they went to other gods, but I'm going to open up a door of hope. I'm going to take you back to this area, and that's just right pretty close to Jerusalem. And he says, so I'm going to take you back to this area, and it's going to be a door of hope. And she shall sing there as in the days of her youth, because when they went over, they were singing when they went into the promised land. It says, and it shall be at that day, saith the Lord, that thou shalt call me Ishi, and shall not call me no more Baali. Now, Ishi means my husband. It's a very endearing term, my husband. And Baali means that they were trying to worship God as God, Baal as God, and then also throw in a couple of the feast days to make people happy, And he says, for I will take away the names of Balaam out of their mouth, and they shall be no more be remembered by their name. Now, he's talking here at a later time, and this is going to be when all of Israel goes back, and to the nation. He says, and in that day, he said, that day will I make a covenant with them, and with the beasts of the field, and with the fowls of heaven, and with the creeping things of the ground, and I will break the bow and the sword and the battle out of the earth, and will make them to lie down safely. And he says, and I will betroth thee unto me forever. Yea, I will betroth thee unto me in righteousness, and in judgment, and in kindness, loving kindness, and in mercies. And I will even betroth thee unto me in faithfulness. And thou shalt know the Lord. And it shall come to pass in that day, I will hear, saith the Lord, I will hear the heavens, and they shall hear the earth, and the earth shall hear the corn, and the wine, and the oil, and they shall hear Jezreel. And I will sow her unto me in the earth. What he's saying, in the end times, now the rapture's got to take place first, and then during that 7-year tribulation period, he says there's 144,000 Jews from 12,000 from each tribe are going to all of a sudden realize who Jesus was, that he was the Messiah. And it says, then when Jesus comes back with the church, and they're prophesying during that tribulation period, all of Israel is going to be saved. All of Israel is going to start worshiping, And then that's what he's saying here. And then once they recognize me, and I come back and set up that 1,000-year reign, he says, then there's going to be peace. the animals are going to live together. And no more. Right now, the lion and the lamb lay down together, but the lamb is inside of the lion. He says, but then it's going to be different. He says, they will lay there in peace. And so I thought I was going to get to chapter 3, but I won't because it's time. But what he's trying to say, as I want to reiterate there in that 4th chapter, he says that the people are being destroyed because of lack of knowledge. And he says, they have rejected me. Now, since the 1960s, we have seen that our country, slowly, we have been desensitized to the homosexual problems. We have been desensitized to people living together and not being married. And we've been desensitized. Now, Billy Graham, in one of his speeches, he said that this guy told him a story about this lady. He says, would you go to bed with me for $1 million? She thought about it and she said, yeah, I would for $1 million. Then he said, would you go to bed with me for $20? She looked, what do you think I am, a whore? And he said, we already established that. He says, now we're just negotiating the price.
Yes.
And so that's the way that with our country now, that what would we give up to miss a couple of weeks at church? Or what would we give up, of our study of the Bible? That it's just a matter of price. How much do you really love the Lord when the going gets tough? When you get sick, when your family members get sick, when you go through tragedies, when you lose your house, when you're overtaxed, you say, forget it all. It says, I know that the troubles of this present time are not worthy to be compared to the glory that will be revealed later on. And this is what he's saying. He says, do you have a price? Are you willing to sacrifice? If somebody had a bullet or a gun and put a gun in your head, would you denounce the Lord Jesus? Like that little girl at Columbine, that he said, you know Jesus? And she said, yes, I do. And he said, well, you're going to meet him. And he shot her right there. But, it takes courage to do that. And so anyway, Hosea had a miserable life because his wife was unfaithful many, many times. And I didn't get to the part that he says that he went down to the slave market and he bought her back for 12 pieces of silver and a bushel and a half of barley. And he said that that's half the price of a slave. And you have to stop to think. Whenever they would sell a slave in those days, they would strip him naked. The shame, the ridicule. And here is Hosea. He's walking down to that slave block. Nobody wanted her. She couldn't have her lovers anymore. They didn't want her because she was, getting up in her 40s or 50s. Who wants somebody like that when they're all dried up and wore out and everything and probably diseased, dirty, straggled? And Hosea goes down and buys her. And it says that takes courage. That takes love. That takes compassion. And God said, while we were yet sinners, he loved us. And he says he was beaten and bruised and bloody, hanging on that cross, that we might have all the privileges that he had before he came. So, thank you. Amen.